Let's get to the elephant in the room as we transition and something that we talked about weeks ago, Drew, the hypothetical conversation of what if Marcus Freeman is not what we think he is? And in terms of what he's done on the recruiting trail, he's been second to none in terms of the first-year head coaches. But as a coach at Notre Dame, he is the first coach for the Irish to start his era 0-3, a loss to Oklahoma State last year. In the postseason, he starts this year with a loss in Columbus at Ohio State, and then a 20.5-point favorite against Marshall. Marshall comes in and wins that game 26-21. Andrew, a lot to unpack here, but I want to get to you and your just initial takeaways, what you saw out of this game and what it might mean for the Irish going forward.
Well, I do think it might be time to panic here a little bit, and I say that because I don't really know what Notre Dame wants to do on offense. You watch the Ohio State game, right? They were super conservative. Seems like they just wanted it to be in that game and keep it close for as long as they could, which is what they did. Against Marshall, there's just no identity. Is this a power running football team? Do they want to throw the football? I think the most alarming stat, and I know we're going to get into the whole quarterback situation, is through 2 games, Notre Dame's wide receivers have caught 12 passes for 199 yards and 0 touchdowns. There's just no dynamic playmakers on the field. It seems very vanilla. Michael Mayer is obviously an elite tight end. He continues to produce, but he's getting double teamed, and it just seems like there's no creativity on that side of the ball. And I think it's a major issue, and I think that's going to make things difficult for Notre Dame this season. And we did say it, Cooper, Marcus Freeman's been billed as this recruiting god. Well, what happens if he lost some games? I mean, the honeymoon's over. He has lost games. He's 0-2, and there's a difficult schedule that lies ahead.
Well, we talked about it, and if you're just tuning into this show, earlier the news that came out of South Bend, it's just getting worse there in terms of starting quarterback Tyler Buckner. He's going to be out 4 months, which is the rest of the regular season, with a high-grade sprain to his non-throwing shoulder. So now Marcus Freeman is going to have to rally around second-string quarterback Drew Pine, who came in and struggled in limited time on Saturday against Marshall. But for me, Drew, I'm with you in terms of what we've seen out of that offense and offensive coordinator Tommy Rees. Even coming into the season, the receiver group was a big question mark, but you thought you would be getting more production out of the running back room, especially with Chris Tyree, who I believe only has 12 touches on the entire season, only had 5 touches last game against the Thundering Herd. So that's been a question mark. But Drew, let's take a look at the big picture from 30,000 feet. And at the quarterback position, you have Tyler Buckner as a true sophomore, Drew Pine as a junior. But the Irish don't have a quarterback committed in this class. They pushed all their chips in on top 247 quarterback Dante Moore from the state of Michigan, Martin Luther King. He ends up pivoting in really kind of surprising a lot of people, but committing to Dan Lanning in the Oregon Ducks. We've seen Notre Dame kind of throw their hat in multiple races, whether that's been Avery Johnson or other places as well at the quarterback position. Now they have CJ Carr, who's one of the best players in 2024, committed. But Drew, I mean, you're sitting here right now as a Notre Dame fan. Is this a cause for concern that you don't have the guy not only on your roster right now, but you don't have him in next year's cycle either?
I think it's just total miscalculation from that offensive staff and Tommy Rees. I mean, remember last year was Jack Cohen was the quarterback. I was reading this morning on our Notre Dame site that the Irish didn't even know if he was going to have 1 or 2 years when they took him from Wisconsin as a transfer. Well, he only had 1, and now we're seeing what they have to do with these quarterbacks. To me, the fact that they don't have a 2023 arm committed is super alarming. I mean, I'm banking on the fact that CJ Carr, who Cooper, me and you both really like in the class of 2024, hoping he hits. I mean, CJ Carr is probably 2 or 3 years away from being able to win games on Saturdays. And I know we like him. I see some Davis Mills in him. I think he's got all the tools. There are some rumors out there that he could potentially reclassify. But to me, I mean, why did Notre Dame not go on Avery Johnson? I was watching some of his clips the other night from what he's doing. He's just a dynamic talent at quarterback that can, a member of my freaks list, so he can run the football, he can spin it around, and it seems like Notre Dame kind of kicked the tires on him, flirted with him, exchanged some text messages, but never asked him out on the date. And I think that's a huge mistake, and I think that we're going to come back a few months from now and look back on this being one of the bigger storylines just nationally in the 2023 cycle. How did Notre Dame botch this quarterback situation? All in on Dante Moore, right? Then they pivot to CJ Carr, but they kind of forgot about the class of 2023. And I think that's what's concerning when we talk about this offense and big picture.
All in on Dante Moore, not to mention that they were in the mix for top 247 quarterback and Clemson commit Christopher Vizina, who was a guy that we really liked all throughout this process and has continued to develop throughout his senior year. They were in good standing there. They end up investing all their resources into Dante Moore. He chooses to go elsewhere, and now it's Notre Dame who's left at the altar in the 2023 quarterback cycle. But Drew, sticking with Notre Dame and the Irish, you think about the implications here on the recruiting trail. One of the best classes in the country, sitting at number 4 in 2023, with the top class in the country in 2024. I mean, I'm looking at some of the names on top of their board right now, starting with top 247 safety Peyton Bowen, a guy who's flirted with Oklahoma and Texas A&M. Notre Dame battling to keep him in the class. And then you have Charles Jagasaw, another top 32 prospect, but Christian Gray, who they beat head-to-head on LSU with. Also Braylon James, a very similar story as well. These were highly sought-out prospects for Marcus Freeman. That's kind of been the feather in his cap early on in the Freeman era at Notre Dame. Do you spell trouble here in Notre Dame being able to keep these type of top 150 prospects in the boat?
So I don't, and why? You know, I covered Notre Dame a few years ago, and it's always been the same thing. Notre Dame recruits a specific type of student athlete. And yes, we saw Keon Keeley back off a long-time commitment to Notre Dame just a few months ago. To me, I think most of these guys are going to stick. Maybe there'll be 1 or 2 defections. I just think it changes kind of the narrative around Notre Dame, this 0-2 start. You go from trying to get Keon Keeley back to having to play defense with some of these other guys. And Notre Dame, they did most of their official visits in the summer. So now you're not even sure if those guys are for sure going to get back on campus. I just wonder what happens, though, if the losses start to mount up. I mean, this schedule, they got Cal coming to town this weekend, eventually play North Carolina. I mean, can Notre Dame score with North Carolina? BYU, that feels like a loss. Syracuse looks very improved. I mean, everyone had that as a W. Is that now a toss-up? I just, if Marcus Freeman goes 7-5, 6-6, maybe this 2023 class sticks, but what happens in 2024? That's where you're really looking for that first-year bump on the recruiting trail. So will certainly be interesting. But I'm not panicking just yet. I just think it, kind of restricts what they can do as they try to round out that 2023 group.
I'm preaching patience, but I'm a little bit concerned if I'm a Notre Dame fan right now. To me, the lights have looked too big for Marcus Freeman on the gridiron. And I think that was the biggest concern coming into the Marcus Freeman era, was the inexperience. I think we've seen that play out through the first 3 games. And even the recruiting, as good as it's been, I think it's going to take a hit here. And I mentioned those guys. Peyton Bowen is certainly a guy that I have my eyes on. Christian Gray as well, and Braylon James in a very competitive recruiting territory in Texas. So Marcus Freeman certainly has his work cut out for him the rest of the season and on the recruiting trail, as now Notre Dame not doing themselves any favors. But Drew, we're going to learn a lot in the next 4 weeks with Notre Dame. They got Cal coming to town, a Cal team that is 2-0, who I'm very familiar with during my time at Washington. Justin Wilcox, one of the best defensive minds in the country. Notre Dame, before that news, to Tyler Buchner, 11-point favorite in that game. I would not be surprised if that's going to be a very competitive football game. After that, Drew, you mentioned they go on the road at Chapel Hill, Drake May in North Carolina, a very high-powered offense. And then BYU, neutral field in Las Vegas, and then Stanford coming to town. So, listen, they got to find a way to really string some wins together over the next couple of weeks, seize back some momentum, and kind of right the ship. But right now, a lot more questions than answers in South Bend. So time to buckle down for Marcus Freeman. We will certainly be keeping an eye on that.